Welcome to Misteyre Creations. I'm your host, AJ, and today we're speaking with the illustrious Joshua Cutchin. He is an author, a musician, who has a broad-minded approach to the paranormal, UFOs, and cryptids. We discuss many things in this two-part episode. The first part is an in-depth look at all things weird. Please enjoy. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Be happy to. I am an author. Sometimes what I say is, if you get stuck next to me on an airplane, I'll say, I'm an author. And if they press, you're like, well, I'm an author of speculative nonfiction, which is my way of, delicately saying that I write about UFOs and Bigfoot and such. And then if they seem receptive to it, then I actually, come out and say, this is, what I write about. So I do write about all aspects of these unexplained phenomena. A lot of my interest focuses on the fairy folk and UFOs, especially the connections between those two. But my latest book is my latest nonfiction book, I should say, is 2022's Ecology of Souls. It's a two-parter looking at how near-death experience and shamanic initiations and alien abductions and trips to fairyland all sort of share the same suite of attributes. In addition to that, I am a musician. I'm a jazz tuba player. There are some of us, there are dozens of us.
Yeah.
But if you see someone playing tuba in a New Orleans style in Atlanta, there's a good chance that it's me. So that's what preoccupies most of my time right now. It's just all those things. We just came out of Mardi Gras season, so I've been quite busy.
Wonderful.
I mean, Louisiana is almost like a country unto itself, and then New Orleans is almost like a country within within that country because there's so many specific cultural things. Not only just the obvious stuff, but also just some of the terminology and some of the traditions and stuff. If you're from anywhere else in the U.S., but I'd argue probably the world too, you look at them and you're like, what is happening here? But once you sort of take that plunge and start to know about it, it's just so rich, and I love all that pageantry and the fact that I the fact that New Orleans is one of the few places on the planet where you can say I play tuba and people don't look at you strangely has always given me a great deal of affinity for that spot. So yeah, a lot of what I do is the brass band stuff, the trad jazz stuff. Although in a couple of months here, before you know it, it'll be Oktoberfest, and then I'll have to put on a different hat, quite literally, put on my little Oktoberfest hat and play a bunch of Oktoberfest gigs. But in between, I'm mostly doing the brass band stuff, which it's a lot of fun. It's really where my heart has been for the past. Oh, how old am I? Geez, it's where my heart's been for the past 20 years or so. So yeah.
Awesome. Um, we're going to jump into some folklore. Ancestral folklore kind of follows us as we travel around the world. Um, when we get to colonizing Mars and the moon, do you think it'll follow us there, and or will we develop new mythologies and folklore?
Yeah, I've thought about that myself. Not specifically in regards to Mars and the Moon, but I look at some places. There's this island in it's off the coast of South Africa called Tristan da Cunha, and it's interesting because um, as far as archaeologists are aware at this point, it had no indigenous population. It was always just populated by seabirds and stuff. It's not a tiny island. I mean, obviously it's not huge, but so it was, sort of incorporated into, I believe, the British Empire at one point, and it was colonized in that regard. And it's always interesting to me because when you look at, you know, one of the first places that I go when I look at a sighting is I often look at the history of the land, the indigenous history, the history that came there with colonialism, especially if it's in the New World, or Oceania, I guess. And there's always, such a rich depth of history to these places. But you look at some place like Tristan da Cunha, and it's like, well, what's there? Like is it solely populated by the beliefs that the settlers brought over to that particular island, or is there something that's always been there or not? Because I do believe that there's an objective reality to a lot of these phenomena. So if I extrapolate that onto like the Mars thing, I don't know. I think that if you look at the sort of diaspora of folklore and superstitions and cultural beliefs and stuff, you can see that a lot of it travels well. I would argue that fairy folklore travels especially well, because it just sort of it travels with. If we're talking about European colonization specifically, it traveled with these individuals to these places, and once the settlers moved in, their existing beliefs were partially retained. Sometimes they also syncretize with, the beliefs that were there because practically every culture has some sort of variation on fairies and little people and stuff like that. But Mars you'd think would be a blank slate. Now, so I would anticipate that we would bring a lot of our folkloric baggage with us as we colonize outer space. Um, but at the same time, I would sort of add a caveat, which is I think that there is such a cultural imagination of space and outer space and what it means and what's there, um in terms of like just humanity's imagination. We've thought for a very long time, we've speculated for a very long time on what other planets might hold, and then the fact that we gave these planets Roman names, I think might have some bearing on that as well. So I would anticipate that you'd see some obvious beliefs being imported over. But I do think that that we have so much imagination tied up in the idea of interstellar colonization that we might sort of create our own folklore, and it might sort of combine with those older myths in a weird sort of way. I at the same time I do think that I do think that there is something to the idea that Mars was inhabited at one point. There's some interesting work by John Brandenburg. Are you familiar with this research?
Yeah.
Yeah, the isotopes that suggest that there was a nuclear detonation, because the only other place that we've observed them has been
Uh,
in nuclear detonations and on Mars.
yeah.
So, that sort of brings into the discussion a whole, bevy of possibilities regarding, ghosts on Mars, which I think would be fascinating to see the way that blends and combines itself with whatever we bring there. I'm not really sure if that's much of an answer to your question. I would anticipate that at first you would see folklore from the settlers on the Martian planet. And then over time, it would sort of become its own thing, is what I would expect. Because if you look at some place like Tristan da Cunha, I've corresponded just very lightly with some individuals from that island, and they do have ghost stories, which is interesting. I think that there are a couple of ghost stories there. But as far as like, this sort of animist idea that there were, some sort of spirits there that are still there, I don't think there's much of an indication of that. But if that model holds, and that's a model that I'm really sympathetic to, the idea that everything is ensouled to a certain degree, then I would anticipate that something would start to bleed through the margins of perception once we land on Mars permanently. That's just my take. I don't know. I mean, I really like that question because I feel like so much of what we see in these modern day encounters from experiencers, is, whether they consciously realize it or not, tied to the folklore of the place and of the people who were originally there.
Yeah.
And yeah, what happens when you find a blank slate? Like, what happens to the experiences? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And how much does the place inform the folklore?
Right.
Because um, well, with Mars, we've developed some folklore of our own of Mars before we've even gone there. So I'm wondering
Exactly.
how much of that will go there with us.
Well, that's sort of the thing that sort of gave me pause when I was considering that question, is because if you look at like the folklore of Mars, which no one has ever been to, it's orders of magnitude um, more abundant than the folklore of a place like Tristan da Cunha, right?
Yeah.
There's, there are some other little islands in the South Pacific here and there. I was just watching an interesting video on YouTube about some people who were stranded on a glorified sandbar, a kilometer square in the Indian Ocean, very much uninhabited, but some of the castaways were able to sort of set up their own society there, and it raises the exact same sort of questions that we're talking about now. Like, what happens when you get this blank slate? Yeah. But we do have all that baggage from going back what 4 centuries probably,
Yeah.
and that's without even sort of ascribing astrology to it or anything
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the more we explore, the more places and things are added to our folklore. Like i- Bigfoot and aliens, that's all relatively recent folklore. That Bigfoot actually goes back quite a bit, but it's a different story the further back you go.
I take the view that like these phenomena have been sort of with humankind ever since the beginning. And wherever you want to place the beginning, that is correct.
Yeah.
That is where it started. It's just the way that we conceptualize these things and the names that we give them and the sort of mythology that we build around is what we sort of recognize today, as you correctly state, in terms of like Bigfoot, the Greys, or the reptilians, or all these things. I mean, not a popular opinion, but I'm not convinced that ghosts are necessarily the souls of dead people. I think that there are a lot of other hypotheses that could probably be entertained as well. I found stuff like the stone tape theory,
Hmm.
really interesting, and egregores and all sorts of stuff. So there are all these possibilities, but the fact of the matter is that people have always encountered things that are most readily perceived as the souls of the dead.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that it would be. I think that some science fiction has played with this idea in terms of like how haunted are these other planets that we're going to, but it'll be really interesting to see a work of fiction tackle that topic with a true Fortean perspective in terms of like the collective unconscious bringing ghosts and whatnot to Mars.
Yeah.
But I mean, you asked that question. We kind of also have somewhat of a basis for that because there are these stories of astronauts experiencing strange things in orbit. There are these allusions to space music and this famous story where these cosmonauts said that they saw a couple of angels floating around the ISS, and so it seems like, but it brings you back to that question. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, similarly, yeah, if there are ghosts and if there are ghosts in space and no one's there to see them, do they even appear? Yeah.
True. It's true. Um, my own thoughts on ghosts. 90% of them I find are recordings. They're something that's been recorded in the strata of where you're living. And point of fact there, my mother and I, the house that we lived in originally had power lines all around us, and it was sitting on uh, quartz rock.
Yep.
And
I've heard that
so
as a factor. Yeah.
yeah, so we were sitting playing a game of cards, and we got quiet. We started hearing people talking, and there was no one else in the house. So we were, is this a ghost? What's going on? And then we realized we were hearing ourselves talking earlier.
Oh, wild! I love that.
And so,
I Yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's something that I think a lot of researchers would do well to avail themselves of. And I'm not saying that I'm good at this either because I have not dived in as deeply as I should. But time plays some sort of role in all these phenomena, I think. And if my biggest problem is that I have a hard time wrapping my head around a lot of the time literature that's out there. I mean, I think Eric Wargo's book on retrocausality is fascinating. In the way that something about time plays a role in this, and I don't think it's linear. I think there's some sort of cyclical quality to it, but But yeah, and if you look at, to your point about these things being recordings, you've got these stories of, oh, I saw, a British redcoat walking through this old tavern, but he was walking on his knees because the original floor was, a couple of feet lower than it is today, and that sort of thing. But it does suggest that there's um, this sort of pre-recorded component to it. At the same time, it is important. Another thing that we should all do, another thing that I'm not very good at, is entertaining multiple explanations for these things. So, as you suggested there when you said that, like most seem to be recordings, but there are those cases where you do have this sort of interaction or communication or something between human beings and what appear to be spirits of the dead, that suggests that there is some sort of intelligence behind the apparition and it's not just a playback. So I think entertaining multiple solutions to these things is going to serve us all well in the future.
True, true. Um, a lot of what I what I see people put a lot onto the area before they go in for an investigation, and what I've been trying to do is go in like a blank slate and see
Thank you.
what comes.
Yes, thank you. So I won't name any names, but I was sitting on a panel at a convention, and the rest of the panel was this team of ghost hunters plus me, right? And the topic of the panel was research. And of course, if you know anything about my work, it's like, oh, cool, research, like, JSTOR and old libraries and dusty manuscripts and stuff like that. And I was ready to talk about that, but with the ghost hunters on the panel, it quickly shifted over into data collection. And one of the first questions where I knew my opinions were not going to be well received was someone from the audience asked about how you prepare for an investigation. And my take was, you kind of don't. Because if you learn that there's a myth, or a legend of a headless cat at this particular house, now you're primed to go see the headless cat. You've introduced that sort of contagion or contamination into what you're expecting. And everybody else on the panel was like, no, we go to the county historical society, and we dig up all the tax records and all the land, the deeds, and this and that and the other, and we find out, oh, well, they see a legend of a woman in white there, but there was no woman in white who ever died there, so it's an urban legend. And I'm just sitting over there going, okay, well, I guess it's just a difference of opinion. I mean, I think there's room for that,
Mm.
but at the same time, I can't tell you how many times I wanted to just be like, my dudes, have you ever heard of archetypes? Like, like there are other ways to interpret this as opposed to like, oh, there had to have been this that happened there or didn't happen there. Like there's an archetypal component, almost a boilerplate
Yeah.
that gets grafted onto some of these hauntings and such. I mean, I'll it's something that I'll be addressing in the future in some of my work, I think. But in 2008, so way back, I did my first overnight ghost experience at Waverly Hills Sanitarium down at the border of Ohio and Kentucky. And one of the things that's seen at Waverly is this being on the fourth floor that scuttles down the hallway towards you, and it sort of crawls on the walls and crawls on the ceiling and crawls towards you. My girlfriend at the time saw that without knowing about it, or I assume she didn't know about it. She described it to me, and I thought that was really creepy. And then it was later that I learned that this was a thing. I'm like, wow, that's sort of confirmational for me.
Mm.
But I'll never forget we were at the this past no, sorry, 2 years ago, I was at the Trans Allegheny um, Asylum in West Virginia, and we got to the fourth floor, and they say here on the fourth floor we have something called the crawler that scuttles along the ground towards you and around on the walls and the ceiling. I'm like, something called the crawler on the fourth floors of famous American haunted spaces. I think that both I mean, obviously, there could be some sort of capitalization and pulling or stealing legends from somewhere, whatever, that's a possibility. But I'm of the opinion that, yes, at both places, something on the fourth floor exhibits the same behavior. Um, but I think that just there is this template or this boilerplate or this, archetype that for whatever reason has an affinity for the fourth floor, I'm sure I could go in and do some numerology and find some sort of explanation for it or something. But it's just interesting to me that you find that exact same concept repeated across time and space. And if there hasn't been any contamination, then that is sort of definitionally an archetype, this sort of thing that pops up independent of cultural transmission. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I do think that once you start looking at a lot of these stories that are attached to these hauntings and whatnot, you do start to see the same themes repeating themselves over and over and over again. And I don't think that they're all true, but at the same time, I think the fact that they are repeating is interesting in and of itself because it suggests that we're interfacing with something that has to do with the source code of reality or something.
Well, when I think of it in a way of physics, how two molecules can be in separate parts of the universe and be connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
the
but it's the
entanglement
same
thing. Yeah.
same molecule, just superimposed in different areas.
Yeah, I think that might be. So I've always kind of I'm interested in the physics angle and the quantum physics angle. I don't normally talk about it a lot because I just know I'm bound to get something wrong, you know. But I do think that there is a lot of inspiration to be drawn from some disciplines like quantum physics that are inserting that sort of uncertainty into a lot of the ways that we normally view a causal
Mm.
universe in Newtonian physics. So yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, maybe archetypes are not quantum entanglement, but um, story entanglement, across different cultures.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. I love that.
it's the more you look into this stuff, the weirder and more expansive it becomes. So you ask one question, you get an answer that makes you follow to like 10 other questions, and so on. It's it's the never-ending story.
Well, and that's why, and I hope I don't offend when I say this, but that's why I get so kind of tired when I talk to these people who are, for example, ufological celebrities, and they're still banging this drum of, it's extraterrestrials. It's got to be extraterrestrials. And oh, well, science will explain telepathy, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying that they're not extraterrestrials, but it's got to be there are aspects to it that are even weirder than that, you know. That are tied up in things like consciousness um and quite frankly the dead and synchronicities and all these things. It all sort of comes together in the UFO question. And um once you are wading into those waters, then why does it have to be scientists from another planet at all? It can be an archetype made material. It can be a spirit. It can be, um, a story that's written that we're all living out. I mean, I don't know, any number of fantastic things sort of enter the discussion. So again, like, why are we stuck to this? Like, why are we should entertain the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but I don't think there's a need to be faithful to the sort of 1950s sci-fi idea of what the phenomenon represents, because it seems to be a lot stranger than we ever imagined back in those days.
Well, when we talk of just UFOs by themselves, the further back you go, the form of the UFO, which is something that came in around the 1940s with radio shows that were describing
Hmm.
saucers. And then further back you go, it's sailing ships in the sky,
Yep.
dirigibles, that sort of thing. And then you go
Yep.
back further, and it's starships, described by ancient peoples like the Anunnaki.
Or the stellar boat
Yeah.
that took the Egyptian soul to the afterlife. Yeah, it seems to constantly adapt. I mean, going forward from that sort of Kenneth Arnold era, we do see these sort of Art Nouveau flying discs, and then '80s, we got the black triangles that look like the stealth bomber, and now we've got these things that just so happen to look like tiny luminous drones, right? The Tic Tac, smaller.
Hmm.
Um, and it does to me suggest that we're interacting with this. I mean, this has been talked about a lot, but I don't think I don't think people always really wrestle with the implications of it. The flying saucer description in Kenneth Arnold used was talking about their movement, not about their shape. And yet the phenomenon reacted by appearing as a disc. So it's almost like our cultural expectations do influence the way that these things appear. When I was working on Where the Footprints End with my friend and co-author Timothy Renner, we sort of perceived something different happening in the Bigfoot uh, phenomenon, which is that if you look at wild men in antiquity, wild men and wild women, um, they were sort of yes, they were always hairy and they always dwelled in the forest, but they were, you know, possessed of an intellect equal to anyone else. They were verbal and they were in fact superior in a lot of ways to the citizenry because they were magical practitioners who knew all about the inner workings of the world. And then over time, the wild man gets more and more feral, as we sort of map all the different spots in the wilderness and we know like, well, here there aren't dragons and things like that. Um, over time. So in as you go through this, granted, there are always these, indigenous stories that have remained relatively consistent, but at least in the Western imagination, the wild man has sort of progressed from those older archetypes of wild men, like Merlin, who was a wild man,
Hmm.
to, okay, well, they're kind of like, these ape men, but they still wear clothes or use human implements. Like there are stories of, that Timothy found when looking through older American newspapers of wild men using muskets and shovels and things like that. And now, as we continue and progress through the 20th century, the wild man, Bigfoot, just tends to get more and more simian in a lot of ways. It tends to be more and more like an ape and not using advanced tools and stuff. So it's an interesting sort of progression. The UFO keeps on getting more and more advanced, and the wild man keeps on getting less and less advanced. And I don't know if that means anything or if that's, research pareidolia, but it does seem to me it's interesting if you embrace the idea that these phenomena adapt to the cultural milieu in which they appear.
See, my own experience with Bigfoot says it's intelligent and not necessarily something that exists all the time. But
I love that. I love the elegance of that statement. Yeah, yeah.
the problem I find is I've had multiple experiences and each one is different. And so I can't pinpoint any one thing to it because I experienced an intelligent one, I experienced a playful trickster one, and I experienced the ape-like thing that just was feral and
Mhm.
wanted me to get the hell out of there. So
That's fascinating, and and see, this is sort of a pitfall I think for cryptozoologists because then they start speculating on different subspecies of Bigfoot and this and that, but like to me, I see some parallels in some other disciplines. So I'd take up that first point that you said about not being always physical or not being. What did you say? You didn't say they weren't always physical or they weren't always.
they're not always physical, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've butted heads with quite a few cryptozoologists on this point because they'll say things like, well, ghosts don't leave footprints, and I'm like, well, if you go back and you read your parapsychological research, like that was the first ghost hunting tool was to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to emerge. Ghosts slam doors and they touch people and they do all sorts of things like that. So our understanding of physical versus non-physical is incorrect, I think. Like I think that there are things. I mean, obviously, like this laptop is physical. Like I don't think it has a psychic component. Maybe it does if I'm being a dedicated animist. Um, but I think that some of these other things do have sort of a physical and a non-physical quality to them. And I think that we're like that. Like I think that we are predominantly physical with an important psychic component. So why can't things like UFOs and Bigfoot have that same shared quality. Sometimes I wonder if whereas we're mostly physical with a psychic component, maybe the UFO is mostly psychic with a physical component because they do leave burn marks in the ground and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, I think you've got to toss out um that sort of dichotomy of thinking about these things. The other thing that I would say with, regards to the different qualities of these experiences that you had, I don't know enough about your experiences, but sometimes I wonder with how um, capricious these phenomena seem, where one day they're love and light, and the next day they're existential dread. I see a lot of that resembling what you see in the literature of psychonauts. People who are taking these substances and having good trips and bad trips, depending
Yeah.
upon set and setting, mindset and the setting that they were in. And I kind of wonder if that's not something that's going on there too. I don't know if your personal experiences would sort of suggest that, but it seems a possibility that's worth entertaining.
Well, we found we have phenomena bombs where
I like this term. I
you
like this term. Tell me more.
you feel something building up, and then all of a sudden you have a rash of experiences, and then it goes
Okay.
away for a little bit, and it builds up again, and it goes off again, and then you have the weirdness where you just go out somewhere and you have an experience, but the phenomena bomb itself is when I had that rash of experiences with Bigfoot. It in the beginning, I had the ape-like thing that was walking 200 meters from me and then disappeared behind a tree and was gone. And then short time later, we were sitting having uh, a tarot reading with a friend and discussing tarot stuff by a tree in the same park area right by where I saw that, and I experienced little furry things playing peekaboo with me. And then uh, about a month later, the end of the explosion, when we had thousands of experiences, it was in October. Go figure.
Yeah, of
And
course.
I was throwing out the trash, and this 9 foot tall thing with glowing red eyes growled at me as if to tell me to get the hell out of there. And me being the broken minded person that I am, I don't get scared by that stuff. I go towards it, and it ran off. So that was
Yeah.
the gist of that experience. And
That's I love this idea of the phenomenon bomb, though. I mean, that's I mean, because I you mentioned earlier about, power lines and quartz, and
yeah,
I've heard those as possible reasons why activity might spike, but if you talk to other people, they'd say, "Oh no, it's an underground source of water." And you talk to another person, and it's, "Oh no, it's a mass grave somewhere on the property." And so I think if you talk to like 20 people, you're going to get 20 different interpretations, right? But what I like about the idea of something like a phenomena bomb is that it sort of accounts for all of these. That there's sort of an additive effect of multiple different factors to reach a threshold, and then it spills over.
yeah,
Um, which does imply that there's some sort of energetic quality to it. But I really do like that because, maybe whenever you go into a space and you kind of get that weird, eerie feeling, maybe you're detecting that the glass is half full. Maybe that's what you're detecting. Yeah, that's a really cool idea.
yeah. I'm gonna go into some weird, really weird circumstantial stuff here.
Oh,
Um,
that's great. I love it.
uh,
I'm all about the really weird. Yeah.
the there's some circumstantial evidence and speculative thought that animals have their own beliefs. Do you think animals' belief systems uh, are real, and do you think they affect how we see phenomena?
I think that if you're going to adopt a position that we live in a more than human world, um, you kind of have to account for that. It's not a, I mean, we've seen something resembling, funerary practices in everything from great apes to elephants and stuff like that. So I should think that there is some sort of belief system there. And if you look at the sort of trajectory that human or the evolution of you know, the I don't know the exact term for it, the hominid evolution, you do find strong evidence that there was a a tradition of burial rites and magical thinking, quite frankly, amongst Neanderthal. Then, if you look at sites like Göbekli Tepe, one of the reasons that that site is so profound is because for you know I would imagine a century at least, there was this notion that the first things that we did as a species, once we sort of gathered together, was to do practical life improvement stuff like farming and hunting. Now, obviously, there was some component of that, but the fact that Göbekli Tepe seems to be a ritual site that predates agriculture suggests that the most important thing that we did when we had the tools, the first thing that we did was we built a temple. We didn't like build this massive agrarian infrastructure. Like we built a temple to connect to this other realm. So the fact that it happened so early and was such an important um, first order priority for human beings, I think would suggest that you could see that as being something that is so fundamental it would appear in animal populations as well. I mean, I think that this conversation too is tied up in, there have been some recent articles that have demonstrated that species like chimpanzees are starting to show more sophisticated tool use and stuff, and all of they are correct, but I would be critical of them. All of the evolutionary scientists are saying, "Oh, look, we're seeing evolution in action." And it's like, yes, but part of what comes with that, I think, is that magical thinking is part of that evolution as well, and magical thinking being a broader term for ritualistic activity and beliefs. So, um, yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying yes. I think that all those things are very true. And I think that there's also the possibility for human action to sort of influence those beliefs as well. I've always found it really interesting how we, as a modernized Western society, sort of just shrug off things like instinct. But when you stop and think about it, you're like, what is that? It's like we can talk about, ancestral memories and all these things, but like if you take a baby chicken who has lived indoors all its life and you pass paper cutout of a hawk or an eagle above it, like it's going to go seek shelter. Like it's not even going to say, what is that? It's just going to instinctually run for cover. So I don't know how you really get to that point unless there is some sort of, morphogenetic field, to use a term Rupert Sheldrake invented, or a Akashic record or something like that, a store of knowledge from which, all these things can be accessed, regardless of whether or not these behaviors are learned. So, I mean, yeah, I think that something that we would do well to embrace the possibility of animal belief and animal ritual, um, more than we have. I mean, there's also, you look at stuff like, the way that your dog circles multiple times before laying down, and we're told, oh, it's looking out for predators and this and that and the other. But uh, I think that some of these interpretations are probably correct of this sort of learned evolutionary behavior. I think some of them are, I do think that some of them are modern variations on just so stories. If you're familiar with that body of folklore, like how the camel got its hump or how the leopard got its spots, like they're just
Yeah,
sort of a quaint explanation that we tell ourselves so that the matter is settled, as opposed to continuing to interrogate other possibilities.
I think we tell ourselves stories to mitigate the things we don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, have you seen? Well, there's this meme. Let me know if you've seen it. It's like one of my favorite memes I talk about all the time. Of this guy who's like hammering nails into the tide as it comes in. and like the hammer says philosophy, and each of the nails says language, and the tide is reality. It's like that's exactly what we're doing. Like
Yeah.
we use our language and our conceptions of things so that we can actually navigate this space. I mean, that was one of the things that Terence McKenna would say, is that he was under the impression that our current consensus waking everyday reality was just as psychedelic as the other spaces that he went into. It's just the fact that we inhabit it more often that we're able to navigate it.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting too, that we're not overwhelmed by it. Yeah.
When it comes to DMT and that sort of thing, I I've experienced LSD by accident because
Oh, geez.
my my brother was an idiot and was dissolving a whole sheet of acid in a glass of water, and I had just taken mushrooms for the first time, so
Oh
I was
no.
thirsty, and I didn't realize that because he had already taken the paper out, that wasn't just water, and I drank the whole glass.
Oh no. And you're here to tell the tale. That's impressive.
I've never had any, because I was on mushrooms at the same time. I've never had any flashbacks. I've never had any problems that way. But that being said, I had died several times before I even had that experience. So I'd
Mhm.
experienced natural DMT. It may
Right.
have changed my brain chemistry enough that I could adapt to that situation.
But between that and the mushrooms, it might have helped, because a lot of these clinical studies are saying that psilocybin actually decreases brain activity. So maybe it just brought everything down to a manageable level. That is, God bless you. That sounds harrowing to say the least. But
Well,
yeah, but also the fact that, like, but I think you did bring up a really good point. The fact that you had these NDEs, something about that experience, I think, sort of knocks loose how easily it is to separate your consciousness from your body. And it's it's I'm trying to think of an apt metaphor, and I can't, but I would imagine that, like, the first time that happens is probably the hardest time. And as you alluded to, you don't even remember the first time, so that's useful. But yeah, I think that that might have a reason for why you came out the other side of it intact. you know So that's, man, that's impressive. I i think that, I mean, that's part of the reason that I ended up writing Ecology of Souls, partly because it was just an idea that I had in my head, and it was, I'd been sort of keeping track of all these little different data points over the years. But um, another aspect of, or another thing that sort of drew me to that project, was the fact that I think there's something fundamental about these altered states of consciousness, of which I would include near-death experiences, by definition, as an altered state of consciousness. And I think there's something that is so misunderstood about them, and has such an important role to play in a lot of these other encounters. I'm not saying that everyone who sees a Bigfoot, or everyone who sees a UFO, is lapsing into some sort of altered state of consciousness, but I think that in some cases that is clearly what is happening. And that's also not a way of saying it's not real or anything like that either. But I think that if we could have more cross pollination of these different disciplines. The cryptozoologists are over here, and the ufologists are over here, and then the near death studies people are over here. If we could have more of a dialogue between these different groups, I think we might see massive strides towards getting to the bottom of them. And I think that at the end of the day, um, the people who probably have the most to say, people who would learn, the people who would have the most to say, would be the near death folks, and the altered state of consciousness folks. Or put another way, the people who would have the most to learn from that sort of dialogue would be the cryptozoologists and the ufologists. The cryptozoologists would have tons to learn from it, because they just never go there. It's like, no, we're talking about, I don't care about the Bigfoot that you saw while you were smoking DMT. I care about the Bigfoot that was seen in the bushes. And it's like, well,
they're
let's
both
open
the
up
same
this
thing.
discussion a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and well, I mean, just the very fact that you're seeing Bigfoot in the wilderness. I mean, granted, I am fascinated by cases of Bigfoot seen in houses and Bigfoot seen in urban environments, and that does happen. But when you think of a stereotypical Bigfoot encounter, it happens in the wilderness, and like where does religious revelation always take place? It always takes place in the wilderness, on mountaintops and
Mhm.
or in subterranean depths or all these sort of different things. This is where a lot of these shamanic initiations happen. And if you look through the Bible, that's where a lot of these, visions happened as well. A lot of other religious traditions talk about time of being out in creation and inviting this stuff to you. So I think there's probably an important thread to pull on there as well.
Um, Sounds in the paranormal.
Mm,
The Sierra sounds, tuning forks and car doors slamming
yep.
in areas that shouldn't happen because we're talking about forests.
Right.
Um, in Ecology of Souls, you didn't mention uh, uh, when people experience NDE. What are your thoughts on the sounds and how that affects?
Well, part of me really doesn't know what to make of it. Because there is that popular idea put forth by one of my favorite ufologists, Jenny Randalls, about the Oz effect, which is this idea that everything goes deathly silent. But at the same time, you do hear these other experiences that are characterized by humming and buzzing noises. That's a staple of near-death literature. I found examples of that in the fairy literature. It appears in Bigfoot stories and UFO stories as well. So I really don't know how to put those two things together because they seem at odds with one another. The only thing that I would suggest would be a lot of these experiences don't seem to allow complete recall very easily. By which I mean, amongst some near-death experiencers, there are some hazy bits about what happens. Uh, Certainly, the impression left in one's memory by dreams and psychedelic trips and UFO encounters is weak. Lots of times there's examples of amnesia. So I would suggest perhaps that when people remember a buzzing or humming sound prior to at the time of their encounter, they're remembering some of the aspects that happened at the beginning of their encounter. And then when they have the silence, they're remembering some aspects that happened at the end of the encounter. Now, obviously, there are a lot of UFO encounters that begin with that silence, but I'm not sure that these memories don't get sort of jumbled and mixed up. That's the only way that I can really reconcile these two seemingly oppositional aspects. As far as what the sound itself does, I mean, um, we were talking about the amount of information that cryptozoologists stand to learn by engaging with the topic of altered states of consciousness. To that extent, I tried to talk a bit about that in Where the Footprints In Volume 2, because if you look at these stories of people getting zapped by Bigfoot, this idea of infrasound, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's not something more along the lines of something like the side effects from an altered state. And to that extent, you do have these stories I've talked about in a couple of presentations that I've done of the beginning of a Bigfoot encounter marked by some sort of buzzing or humming sound, which again is, as we've addressed, is a staple at a lot of these encounters at the onset. Um, there's also I've found some allusions to someone who felt that they were being hit with infrasound, and they compared the noise that they were hearing. They were actually hearing a vocalization from the Bigfoot that sounded like a didgeridoo or like Tuvan throat singing. This idea of a drone with another
Yeah.
melody on top of it, and of course a drone is a buzz and all that sort of thing too. And these drones are very much used in ecstatic practices and can amplify altered states of consciousness. So I think that might have something to do with it. If we look at the fairy literature, lots of times people hear humming or buzzing noises. The most famous example is the Cornish story. I can't remember the exact year. I believe it was the 17th century. This girl by the name of Anne Jeffreys, who was brought back from fairyland. She said it went dark and she heard a sound like, thousands of flies buzzing around her, which sounds like very much the exact same thing. So that's a lot of breath on my part spent on saying I don't really know exactly what it is, but it does feel like another one of those important pieces of the puzzle. Um, and I don't know if it's somehow part of what facilitates this experience, or if you want to bring in, some new age ideas about vibrational frequencies or something along those lines. And I think, I used to be really I used to be really sour on a lot of those new age vibrational ideas, but I've since kind of come around to see how they might be expressing a certain type of truth, and I'm willing to entertain some of those ideas now. But I'm not really sure how it fits in, other than to say that like it is something that is consistently seen across a lot of these phenomena, and I would hazard a declaration by saying that it seems to happen more at the beginning than at the end, but that's by no means a hard and fast rule.
I'm wondering because we're studying uh, uh, tectonic strain theory by uh, Michael Persinger, um, where infrasound or magnet uh, magnetic frequencies affect the brain and cause people to have experiences. I'm wondering if some of these experiences where the sounds and that happen, it could be they're on a fault line or near a fault line where one of these expulsions of electromagnetic energy causes them to have that experience, or could be an element affecting it because we
Yeah,
can't.
yeah. Well, no, I mean that's the most frustrating thing about Persinger is you look at that research, you're like, oh, you're so close. You're so close, but you're not willing to take it that extra little bit. Um, and the idea that like, oh, this explains what's happening as opposed to, oh, this is facilitating what's happening. It's kind of like around the discussion of DMT. Like, people have drawn comparisons between DMT and near-death experiences, and they say, oh, okay, well, when you have trauma, you get a flood of endogenous DMT, and that's what's happening. It's like, or that's facilitating what's, you
Yeah.
and I think that might be something similar with the Persinger stuff. I think that there is something important and perhaps, you know, lowercase t true, about what's happening with the ley lines and the fault lines.
Mm.
Sort of a Freudian slip there, I guess.
Yeah.
With the fault lines and the piezoelectrical currents and all this stuff creating a magnetic effect. Um, I did have the opportunity this past spring of putting on a Corin helmet, a Persinger helmet.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a good example. It's kind of a good example of what we were talking about because I knew all the stuff that you were supposed to experience, and if I hadn't, maybe my impressions would be different and perhaps a little bit more interesting. I did get the sense once or twice that I was not alone in the space that I was using it, and I talked to the administrator because I had my eyes closed. Or maybe I was blindfolded. No, I think I was blindfolded. I talked to the person who administrated it to me, and they said no, no one was ever here. So I did sort of get a little bit of that sense of a felt presence, but it was not nearly as dramatic as I'd hoped it would be. But also, I think that these things vary in terms of sensibility from person to person. Um, which would, explain why very little strange happens to me. um, Maybe I'm just sort of psychically dead as a doornail. I don't know. But but there's something important about that, and I think that you're onto something there with the idea that somehow the sounds might be related to these electromagnetic influences that, again, not are an explanation for the
But a
supernatural or the
facilitation.
paranormal, but both are facilitating it. Yeah. The what is it I say in ecology? The key is not the room that it unlocks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's just a key. Yeah, yeah.
Um, we're gonna get into some music here.
Okay.
Music seems to be a universal language, part of the human experience, going back to Paleolithic times. Um, it's a huge part of folklore as well. Um, what are your thoughts on music as a medium in folklore and experience?
Well, I think that it plays a role. I mean, it does. So we sort of touched on this a little bit with our discussion of the Bigfoot stuff. I think that music's true utility, one that goes vastly underappreciated, is the creation of altered states of consciousness on demand.
Yep.
I mean, like, the scholars try to put a pin in this and they say, oh, your blood pressure changes and, a notable change in mood. I'm like, well, it literally like interfaces with the more than physical aspect of yourself and pulls you into a different space. Like,
Yeah.
you can listen to listen to those early Tom Waits albums and just really get down,
Yeah.
or you can listen to some ecstatic songs that just bring you into that happy place. For me, it's probably September by Earth, Wind and Fire. It's like
Yeah.
that
Awesome.
instant dopamine hit. You know what I mean?
Yep.
There's some songs that are just effervescent, but like the change is immediate, and we all recognize. Even when you are feeling down, like in my experience, I listen to music and I can't help but notice some sort of change. You know what I
Yep.
mean? If I listen to something that is happy, like even if I don't want to feel happy and I'm being grumpy and I'm being angry, like a part of me cannot help
Yeah.
myself and will be sort of elevated by that experience. So I think it's the altered state of consciousness on demand. Something that I'm interested in talking about more lately is the fact that I really do think that something that a teacher of mine said a while back, and I've heard it, and I was kind of like, this is an odd thing to say, but it made perfect sense now. Is that the primary form of expression in music, I don't think is harmony. I mean, I think harmony is important, but he said at the time, he said the primary means of musical expression is rhythm, and this is like a classically trained university professor saying this. I'm like, really? Because like all we ever hear about is harmony, 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 especially if you grew up in that sort of Western musical tradition.
Yeah.
Um, but the older I've gotten, the more I've seen that I really do think that is the case, that rhythm um, is incredibly important to all this, and it's why like um, it's kind of tragic that the idea of a hippie drum circle has become a punchline
Yeah.
because like there's something really cool about that. There's something really, it's been misused in sort of a goofy kind of way, but there's something really cool about this idea of communal drumming and the way that it can synchronize people.
Hmm.
Um, you know, quite frankly, not only in the immediate area, but also across vast distances. To have that sort of synchronization, I think might prove very useful to civilizations that didn't have other forms of communication. So yeah, I think that rhythm is one of the primary motivating factors in this. It's almost like rhythm is what's the most important part of the cake? Well, we all might like icing, but the most important part of the cake is the cake. And I
Yeah.
think that the rhythm is the cake and the harmony is the icing on the cake to actually
Hmm.
give it a little bit more character and flavor.
Yeah. I've experienced the hippie drum circle type thing. And at the time, uh, my wife and I we were at a pagan retreat,
Hmm.
and she was off with the women doing their thing, and us guys were doing a drumming thing where two people would, and basically it's kind of one person would be the stag, and a person would try to catch the stag. It was like
Yeah,
a rite
yeah.
of passage type of thing, and we were drumming and getting into it, and my wife was like, I want to be doing that. And it's rhythm. As soon as you get into the rhythm,
Yeah.
you start to move. um Talking to Carl Kirkholland about magic a couple weeks ago. Uh we talked about the dance of magic. When you're doing magic, you get into a zone where the energy is moving you, and that has a rhythm to it. There's always a
Right.
rhythm, and same with martial arts. You get
Yeah,
into.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons that like I mean, I grew up in that classical tradition and I was on that trajectory so hard for so long. But I haven't found, I never found, past tense, the amount of reward that I have in the more improvisatory traditions. Now, granted, as a tuba player, I don't always get the chance to take a an improvised solo, and um, you know, there have been, I would say, the number of times that I've had that opportunity, and I've, metaphorically crapped my pants on stage is more than the times that I've done something really great, right? But there are those times when I've done something that I'm satisfied with in that regard that I go back and listen to it and I'm like, I wasn't doing that. Like I don't know who that came or who that where that came from or who it came out of, but that's not me. There's that sort of flow state,
Yeah.
low key possession like
Yeah.
thing going on.
Yeah.
I think to also to the issue of like synchronization. I mean, it's I've talked about this with some other folks. You know, I play in horn bands where everybody's playing a wind instrument. So it's not like, a lot of other bands where you can sort of like shout something to the drummer, because he's the only person without anything on his face. Um, but if I work with a drummer long enough, like I can convey a complete change in style, tempo, breaks, rhythms, whatever, just with a knowing look. And I mean, like, obviously, part of that is the fact that we're familiar with each other's body language. Like, that's obviously a factor.
Yeah.
But part of it, I do think, is really something that's more like an interfacing network of consciousness. There's some sort
Yeah.
of low-key telepathy going on too. I really do think that. Because sometimes I've done it, and it's just been like, we've never done this before, but we looked at each other and we just fell right into sync. Everybody else in the band who wasn't looking at us, they had to catch up. But me and the drummer, because I don't have a chance to even breathe half the time.
Yeah.
Um, just completely fell into sync. It's a really strange thing, but it's one of the aspects that I find so gratifying about improvisatory and commercial styles.
Yeah. Yeah. You get that. They call it the zone.
Yeah, I've heard zone, I've heard flow state,
Yeah.
a lot of these different things, but I think it's all trying to describe the same thing. Yeah.
I would like to thank Joshua Cutchin for coming on the show with us. We discussed a lot in 2 hours that we talked together. I really like how he thinks about the paranormal. It's great to find a person who looks at the broader scope and is willing to present that to the world. I have a list of his books, his website, and the course he discusses at the end of part 2. Please, if you can, join the course or purchase it afterwards. You'll learn a lot. His books are great. He's an awesome person, and he was fun to talk to. Thank you, Joshua. That's all I have for you now. Hope you have a good day, and we'll see you soon. Please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you follow us on, or join our streaming service and get a ton of behind-the-scenes content, like book club, podcasts, and shows with our partners, and much more. Misteyre Creations is part of Parasortium, a safe place to learn and create.